It begins with a knock that sounds like an ending. A creditor stands at a widow's door, and behind him, the future narrows. Her husband, a student of the prophets, a man who loved God, has died, and the debts he could not pay now stalk the living. The law allowed what compassion would never choose. Her 2 sons could be taken as slaves to settle what was owed. She has grief in one hand and fear in the other, and both are heavy. The home feels smaller each hour, as if the walls have learned how to lean inward. She does the wise thing. She cries out, not into the cold air of self-pity, but toward the warmth of counsel. She goes to Elisha, the prophet, with words that carry both history and hope. Your servant, my husband, is dead. You know he feared the Lord. The creditor has come to take my 2 sons. There are prayers that rehearse facts as if God were uninformed. This is not that. This is the kind of honesty that opens a window. Elisha answers with a question that sounds almost rude until it becomes revelation. What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? It is a strange pivot from catastrophe to inventory. The widow looks around the room she knows too well and finds there is almost nothing left to name. Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. The sentence hangs between despair and possibility. Nothing and except stand shoulder to shoulder like rivals. That small jar, a daily necessity, is suddenly reintroduced as material for a miracle. God often begins there, in the corner of the cupboard we have stopped noticing, with the provision we assume is too small to matter. Elisha's instructions are not theatrical. They are domestic, humble, specific. Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbours, empty vessels and not too few. Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons and pour into all these vessels. When one is full, set it aside. The verbs have a rhythm. Go, borrow, shut, pour, set aside. The plan depends on community and privacy in equal measure. Community to provide the empty space, privacy to protect the holy work from premature commentary. Salvation in this story is neither solitary nor performative. It is neighbourly obedience done behind a closed door. The sons scatter with urgency that looks like faith in motion. They knock on doors and ask for emptiness. In a society that measures value by fullness, this request is its own kind of sermon. Bring me the containers you are not using. Bring me your quiet capacity. The neighbours respond with a generosity we are not told to admire, but to imitate. Soon the house is a gallery of absence. Bowls, jars, flasks, each one a potential sentence waiting for God to finish the paragraph. Then the door closes. The room is quieter than the street and fuller than it looks. The widow lifts her small jar and tilts it over the first vessel. Oil, a common, ordinary thing, falls with a new assignment. It does not run out. She keeps pouring. Her hands move. Her heart recalibrates. The sons shuttle containers like acolytes in a sanctuary, and the room transforms into a choreography of trust. One vessel fills and is set aside. Another takes its place. The oil does not argue with gravity or hurry the moment. It obeys the tilt of her faith with the steadiness of God's kindness. We are not told how long it took. We are told the only limit was the number of empty containers. When the last one reached the brim, the widow, still in the habit of hoping, said, "Bring me another." One son answered the line that ends the miracle, "There is not another." Then the oil stopped. Scarcity did not starve the miracle. Scarcity defined its edges. The supply of God had been more than enough for the capacity she had gathered. If faith had arms that day, they grew longer with every borrowed jar. She returns to Elisha to ask what comes next. He does not ask for a cut or erect a shrine. He gives a simple restorative command: go, sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. Provision becomes dignity. The miracle does not end with applause. It ends with a household stabilized, a future reopened, and a family untaken. God's kindness here is practical enough to touch bills and holy enough to teach hearts. The story closes the way true mercy often does, not with spectacle, but with sustainable life. What does this mean for those of us who know the sound of impossible knocks? First, the question is still the same. What do you have in the house? Not what is missing, not who will rescue you from every responsibility. God's habit is to multiply what we offer, not what we withhold. A small jar of time, a small jar of skill, a small jar of patience in a relationship that has learned to flinch. These are not excuses to surrender. They are invitations to begin. The math of heaven respects little things because heaven knows what little things become when God touches them. Second, notice the order. Borrow empty space, then shut the door. Public need, private trust. We like the opposite. We assume that if enough eyes watch us, faith will grow, or that noise can substitute for obedience. But some of God's gentlest wonders happen where only a few can see, because only a few will protect the tenderness of beginnings from the drafts of cynicism. The door is not cowardice, it is concentration. It is the place where you learn the difference between performing belief and practicing it. Third, the miracle matched the measure of obedience. Not too few, the prophet had said. The phrase has chased me through many rooms. How often do I gather too few? How often do I bring God one vessel and ask him to prove himself within the space of my caution? The widow gathered a lot of room for grace to land. If we were to translate her work into our daily lives, we might ask, how many apologies am I willing to carry to the next conversation? How many minutes will I borrow from my habits to pour into scripture and prayer? How many opportunities to serve will I set beside the small jar I already have, so that when oil begins to flow, it will have somewhere to go? If this story helps you see your small jar differently and you want others to find hope in their own homes, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. There is also the theology of the shut door. Jesus later speaks of praying in secret, of giving without fanfare, of fasting without a trumpet. Those teachings echo the scene in the widow's home. Some treasures sour in the air of attention. Oil poured in public becomes an exhibition. Oil poured in private becomes provision. The difference is not shyness, but purpose. Privacy here is not about hiding. It is about honouring a work that is too tender to share before it is strong enough to serve. And then there is the neighbourly grace of borrowed vessels. The miracle overflowed a single household because a whole street loaned its emptiness. I wonder how the neighbours felt when they later realised what their quiet generosity had held. Perhaps they saw her sons walking free and smiled without needing the full report. Perhaps they found traces of oil in the seams of the jars when they took them back home, and felt a question rise in their own hearts. What empty spaces am I guarding that could be offered to someone else's need? We often ask God to multiply within us while forgetting that he also multiplies between us. If the widow's story had a chorus, it would sing this: God multiplies what is surrendered. The small jar was always small. What changed was its availability. She poured it out at a rate that mocked fear's calculus and discovered that God is not threatened by our courage. Fear says, measure before you pour. Faith says, start pouring and let God measure. Fear says, protect what is left. Faith says, invest what is left in the direction of trust. And when the last jar is full, faith dares to ask for one more, not because it is greedy, but because it has learned that God is not stingy. Before we rush to applications, stay with the woman for one more moment. She is not a metaphor. She is a person with a name we are not given, whose pain is not a literary device. God's compassion for her is not a lesson first. It is love first. Theology that forgets that becomes brittle. Elisha's question, "What do you have?" is not a corporate audit. It is the kindness of asking her to see what grief had made invisible. Sometimes the holiest thing a friend can do is help you notice your small jar again. So how do we live this story without turning it into superstition? We do what she did. We present what we have. We gather capacity, we protect the process, and we obey the next instruction. We do not buy into the lie that faith is a lottery ticket we wave at our bills. We accept that miracles often arrive wearing work clothes. Go, sell the oil, pay your debts, live on the rest. That line might be the most underrated miracle in Scripture. Live, not just survive, not just delay disaster. Live. A mother keeps her sons, a home keeps its future, a neighborhood keeps its story of God's quiet abundance. You might not owe money to a creditor, but perhaps you owe apologies to people your fear has underloved. Perhaps you owe time to a calling you have treated like a hobby. Perhaps the debt is inner, the backlog of rest you have refused to take, the Sabbath you have sold for productivity. What do you have in the house? A small jar of patience, a small jar of attention, a small jar of courage to ask for help. Bring those to the counter. Borrow emptiness from friends who will hold it without judgment. Close the door. Begin to pour. And as the oil of discipline, forgiveness, and grace flows, set aside each full vessel. Name it. Gratitude, reconciliation, repaired trust, steadier sleep. These are not fantasies, they are the ordinary shapes of extraordinary mercy.